Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for being here. I'm delighted to be with you all tonight to launch a book that has been near and dear to our hearts and that we're really excited to have out in the world. Today is the launch day for 37 Words, so happy book birthday to 37 Words. My name's Sam. Many of you who have been to these events before or attended them online might know me. I am one of the co-owners of the Norwich bookstore, and I am delighted to have you here, whether you're coming here for the first time or the 30,000th. We're so glad to see you. Thank you to CATV for being here this evening. Now, about those books. Tonight we are discussing 37 Words. It is this beautiful book right here, out today from the new press. This book is one that we have been very excited about for quite a while here. I know that many of you have been excited about it because you've pre-ordered it, and thank you for that. Your book purchase, it is kind of what keeps this whole machine rolling here. It is what keeps the lights on here at the Norwich bookstore. It is what keeps me able to come up here and do these long-winded introductions every day. It is what allows authors like Sherry Boschert to keep writing and working and touring and doing the good work that they do. So, don't be shy. If you haven't picked up a copy or 5 of 37 Words tonight, you'll find some in the front room, behind you, but it is the front room, after the show, and I encourage you to pick up one or a few of these books. Sherry would be happy to sign, personalize, and scribe as you see fit, and that book purchase is what keeps this whole thing going. So thank you so much for helping us to keep doing this. And now, without further ado, I am so happy to finally be welcoming this book into the world. Tonight we're here to talk about 37 Words, Title IX, and 50 years of fighting sex discrimination. It is an important history, it is a fascinating history, and it as becomes more apparent every day, it is an ongoing history. It is appalling, but also somewhat, it can be appalling how much of the work still needs to be done, but inspiring how much of it is being done by now a new generation of activists. And this book is sweeping in its history from pre-Title IX into the present day, and if you haven't picked it up, if you haven't looked at a copy yet, I think you will want one at the end of this evening. We are so excited to hear this discussion. We are so happy to have Sherry Boschert in our community as a journalist, as a community member, as a writer, and I'm so glad to be welcoming her. Sherry Boschert is an award-winning journalist and the author of 37 Words, Title IX, and 50 Years of Fighting Sex Discrimination, which is out today from the new press. Her first book was Plug-in Hybrids, the Cars That Will Recharge America, which helped speed the transition to today's electric cars, another ongoing movement. And she joins us tonight here at the Norwich bookstore. She lives right here in the Upper Valley in Lebanon, and you can find more about Sherry at sherryboschert.com. And joining Sherry tonight in conversation is Kate Rodenberg, who is the program director at WISE. Since 1971, WISE has been the only advocacy organization providing support to survivors of gender-based violence in the Upper Valley and 23 communities impacted by it, offering survivor-centered advocacy, prevention, education, and mobilization for social change. You can learn more about WISE and their mission at www.wiseuv.org. Please, all of you, join me in welcoming Sherry Boschert and Kate Rodenberg.
When I used to do schools programs, they would tell me they heard me next door, so I was really teaching 2 classes at once, and that was without a mic.
Well, thank you all for being here, and for those of you who hopefully are watching on Facebook Live, my family, my wife and I just moved here a little under a year ago, and so I wanted to find a way to include my new community and my old community in this event. Before we get to talking about the book and about WISE, I will say this multiple times tonight, But for anyone who buys my book tonight, I will donate 20% of the cover price to WISE. Or even better, if you want to donate $100 to WISE, I will give you a free book. So we will talk about WISE, and for those of you on Facebook who may not be as familiar with this wonderful organization, I hope by the end of the evening you'll be willing to support them too. So I am a journalist. I mostly covered medical news during my career. I wrote my first book in 2006 about electric vehicles. And about 7 years ago, I got it into my head to write another book. I wanted to write about something that inspires me. And at the time, there were news headlines about, in this past decade, the immense and impressive activism on campuses to try and force society and force educational institutions to finally deal with the problem of sexual violence on campus. There is a long history of the movement against sexual violence. The story of Title IX, in fact, and the reason I found it fascinating, is it's a story of movements, and movements are people. And movements don't just happen and stop. They're movements. They keep moving. So I can't stress enough how the civil rights movement inspired the creation of Title IX and the application of Title IX, inspired the women's movement. The women's movement obviously had a huge role in creating and enforcing Title IX. But also the movement for disability rights, the LGBT queer rights movement. All of these use Title IX as a tool. The immense progress that we've seen in society that we credit to Title IX over the last half century really came from these movements. Title IX is a tool. So for me, getting into what was behind Title IX and the movements and the people, and then finding certain people who I could follow over time to give the story a narrative arc, to keep you turning the page. Because if I just threw facts and figures at you, you would be bored stiff, right? So there's got to be some good story in there. At the time Title IX was created, which was between 1970 and 1972 when it passed, all of these movements were happening. One of the movements happening as part of the women's movement was that rape crisis centers were being set up by women's rights activists and things like that. And my understanding is that's how WISE came to be. Is that right? Tell people about WISE, especially the people who don't know it.
Yeah.
And talk about your history a little bit.
Yeah, you share a lot about the kind of zeitgeist of the 60s going into the 70s and how organized people got to respond to the issues that they saw affecting their neighbors and friends. And that is entirely how WISE was put together in the Upper Valley in a little apartment over the head of, I think, the hardware store, which is now Ledyard, right? Is that right? And we just did a podcast, because it's our 50th anniversary as well, talking to some of the founders and even the first paid executive director of WISE. And really what they were sharing was there were these movements happening nationally. There were these issues that they saw impacting women in their community. And they also felt lonely and wanted to connect with one another. And this one person that's on the podcast talked about, like, she was looking for friends. Her boss told her she might like the ladies at WISE, and she walked over and just found her people. And I think when you were talking about all of the individuals, the humans, and the ways that they both came together and had conflict and struggle and came up with these really creative strategies, implementing the tools that we were given, like how that plays out, not just for WISE, but how we've situated our organization both as deeply committed to the Upper Valley and connected with the coalitions that we share this mission with across our states, across the country.
And so what did WISE look like at the beginning? Was it, 6 women who came together and decided to do something, or what was it?
Yeah, really, people who came together and said, like, women are getting the short end of the stick, and how do we start to right that a little bit? And we're really trying to figure out, like, what is it that we want to do? So WISE was first called Women's Information Services. I know you asked about that earlier. and was really like, what can we do? How can we give women the information that they need to adequately take their place in society, to really engage with the rights and the tools that were becoming available nationally and utilize those to be able to make decisions in their own lives. And as the 80s kind of came about and started to have more recognition of the issues of gender-based violence that were primarily impacting women and children and people who are non-binary, we realized the necessity of really becoming organized around a specific mission and took up that task. So now we go by WISE to signify that all people are impacted by gender-based violence and all people in our community are part of that solution. And it's grown and evolved a lot over the decades, but still really, I think, holds true to this. How do we help people have the information and resources they need to thrive, to access their equal rights?
That's awesome. You know, this, the movement against gender-based violence and sexual violence is what inspired me to start to look into the history of Title IX and think, you know, maybe I need to write a new history, because in 2014, there had been several books about Title IX up until then, but they all focused on athletics. Because people of my generation, if they know Title IX at all, they know it as the law that got girls into sports, right? Just as, and you can follow along at home on Facebook if you want, but how many people here, when you were in high school, had sports teams? I want women to raise their hands. Did you have sports in high school? Raise your hand. Oh, I'm so proud of you. This must be an Upper Valley thing. They had access to sports, but a lot of people didn't.
Not me. I'm not young.
And, you know, that was the first thing Title IX was known for. It's really in the last decade that it's become known more for dealing with sexual harassment and assault on campus. But even that goes back to 1977. The first case was at Yale in 1977, Alexander v. Yale, and there's some fascinating stories around that. But the origins of Title IX had nothing to do with any of that. The origins of Title IX came out of jobs, because women, number one, were being excluded mostly from graduate schools. There were quotas on how many women they would let in. A lot of them were excluded by certain undergraduate schools. And then even if they graduated, they couldn't get a professorship or a job or this. And even if they were lucky enough to get one of those, they were kept in the lower ranks. So my book is called 37 Words, but my website is also called 37 Words. And I've been blogging for the last 6-7 years as I work on this book. And I've posted little snippets of videos from the people that I interviewed. And I'm glad I video recorded them, partly because I knew that by the time I finished this book, some of them still wouldn't be alive because they were pretty old. And so this was a historical record. The ESPN TV is producing a 4-part documentary that will air in June on Title IX, and they're using a fair amount of my video recordings, which is a nice little paycheck for me. But really, for me, it allows viewers to see these people and hear from them directly. And eventually, all these materials will end up in some library archive somewhere. So I'm really glad I recorded them. But the very first person, I'll tell this story and then we can go back and forth. The very first person who I reached, as I started to research online, like, who's responsible for Title IX? Well, there was a woman named Bernice Sandler, who was known by the nickname Bunny, who was listed online here and there as the godmother of Title IX. She kept coming up again and again. And she, at the time, lived in Washington, D.C., and I happened to be going there as part of my job as a reporter. And I called her up, and she said, come on over. And she gave me 5 hours of video recording, which was priceless. And I interviewed her multiple times after that, too. She has since died at age 90 about 2 years ago. But her story set it all off. In 1969, she was earning her doctorate in education at the University of Maryland. And her department happened to have 8 openings for tenure track positions. And she loved to teach on the college level, and she was good at it. But she couldn't get an interview. And she was a little older than some of the other students. She was in her 40s by then, and was kind of friendly with the faculty. So she went to one of them and sat down in his office and said, "Why can't I even get an interview?" And without missing a beat, he said, "Well, let's face it, Bunny, you come on too strong for a woman." And she went home and cried, and she believed him. Why did I raise my hand in class? Why did I participate in seminar? It took her a few weeks to figure out there was something more going on than just her personal failure. And she thought, this is morally wrong, but is it legal? Her grandmother had taught her something she called bibliotherapy. If you don't understand something, ask. And if you still don't understand it, read. Read everything you can find about it. So that's what she did. She did bibliotherapy. And being an academic, she read the footnotes. So she read all the civil rights laws and all the writings about the civil rights laws. And there was exceptions to everything. There was exceptions to Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. There's an exception to the Equal Pay Act of 1963. There's exceptions to everything. It seemed legal. But in a footnote, she found reference to 2 executive orders that said federal contractors cannot discriminate on the basis of sex. And a light bulb went off in her head. And she thought, well, every college in the country gets a federal contract, so they're not allowed to discriminate. So it's not legal. And she was home alone and she screamed. And then she thought, well, what do I do now? And the story from there is the story of Title IX. But it took that one person trying to figure out why and what's fair and what's right and what can I do about it. And that was the beginnings. So it had to do with jobs. She was never athletic. She wasn't even thinking of sports, and no one was thinking about sexual harassment. That's how it began.
2 things that I love about that story. One is just like the patriarchy underestimated us when they had all of these brilliant women that they wouldn't give jobs, so they had all this free time. And like, look what happens. And the other thing is just like how generous to like have a stranger reporter call up and say, come on over and here's 5 hours. And I just think about all of the things that have happened because women and people who were suffering were just so generous with their time and attention and were willing to listen to what people needed and then dig deep and we're going to find something and we're going to use it.
Yeah. Well, it was more generous than she knew because once Bernice Sandler thought that I was all right and that I asked good questions, some of which she'd never been asked before, she told everyone in her circles, she's good. And that opened the doors for so many other interviews. And it just gave me the kind of pass that I could never have gotten on my own. It would have been much harder work without that. But talking to Bernice Sandler too helped me realize, you know, the reason she was willing to have me come over and she would spend 5 hours with me, one was she was recovering from hip surgery, so she wasn't going anywhere.
She had time.
She had time. But her whole life after that was connected with Title IX. And she spent her whole life trying to realize the vision of Title IX. You know, once it passed, believe it or not, and she really bent this, she thought, okay, sexism in education will be gone within a couple of years. And that didn't happen. So then she extended it to 5 years.
Yeah.
Well, then she extended it to 10 years. And she finally realized it's going to take more than my lifetime. And here we are after her lifetime. And it's still a struggle. It's still an ongoing movement. You know, one law doesn't fix anything. It has to be embraced in the consciousness of people and society. And I did a lot of research. I went to the Library of Congress, of course. I went to Oregon Historical Society, which is where the papers of Representative Edith Green are. And she is the mother of Title IX. It was her bill. And in the Senate, it was Senator Birch Bayh. And I interviewed tons and tons of people. But that gave me the entry, and it also planted in my mind, okay, how am I going to structure this book as an interesting story and a page turner, I have Bernice Sandler's whole life. What happened in her life? And I kept looking for people like that. And everyone I interviewed, I said, okay, you have a Title IX story, and if you're about my age, do you have any kids? Do they have a Title IX story? And sure enough.
Sure.
And so you have the story of generations. So that, in the end, I ended up with 3 main characters whose lives from the 1970s on kept intersecting with Title IX. And then some, I call them major minor characters from this past decade of activism. And I follow their lives too. It's just, you know, they have shorter lives, so it's a shorter part of the book. But that helped me structure the book too. Now, you read a little bit of it.
I read the whole thing.
You read the whole thing?
Devoured it.
Okay. What jumps out to you as something that you didn't know or that you learned?
Well, I mean, so much of it I didn't know, and I was actually surprised because, you know, I spent a good part of my life really steeped in the anti-gender-based violence world and sort of feminist thinkers, but it wasn't until I got into this last chapter of campus activism where I was like, oh, this is my nostalgia. I know these people. These are the actions that I remember really being big. And so, you know, you were talking about how movements are made up of people and they come and go and evolve. And I was seeing that not only in the different ways that Title IX is being implemented and sort of brought into the cultural understanding, but also how that's played out in terms of what were the most pressing needs that were coming up at the time. Where were the real pain points? And when we kind of started to have some traction there, all of the ways that they could then flourish out into other people finding other ways to have their needs met by following the examples of the people coming before them.
I would say among those major minor characters from the last 2 decades, and some of you might recognize some of these, again, we go back to Yale. There were a number of students there in the 2000s, or the aughts, however you call that decade, who were just fed up with continuing sexual harassment and assault. Now, in that first case in 1997 about sexual harassment, it was called Alexander v. Yale. It was the first time anyone sued for sexual harassment under Title IX. And they had no idea. They were winging it. They didn't know if the court would allow that. And the very first judge, luckily, did say, yes, Title IX does apply. Sexual harassment is not allowed under Title IX. But he then kind of destroyed the case. The case was brought by 5 female students and 1 gay male professor. And they were all white except one, a woman named Pamela Price, a student. And the judge threw out everybody except Pamela Price on technicalities. And then a different judge who took over the case reduced it to what's called a tort case. I mean, they had sued asking Yale to have a grievance policy, to have some kind of policy around sexual harassment. There were none at any of the colleges and universities. And all they wanted was a way to have a channel for complaining about what was going on. Well, the judge threw that out, and they made it a tort case. You're saying you were harmed. You have to prove to me how you were harmed. Otherwise, you got no case. So you have the word of one young black student, a woman, against a white male professor. You want to guess how that turned out? In 1970, well, it was 1979 by the time it ended, and they appealed. Anyway, she lost the case. But within 5 years, colleges started adopting sexual harassment policies and grievance procedures, and it grew from there. One of the plaintiffs in that case, Anne Olivarius, who went on to become a wildly successful feminist attorney, and attorney in many other spheres too, her children all went to Yale. And 2 of them were on the board of the Women's Center in the 2000s, when once again, students were fed up with all of this. And they got together and they filed another a Title IX complaint, because by then the courts had gotten really wacky and the courts were not as useful. That's another story, but And so filing a complaint with the Office for Civil Rights became an even more important avenue of redress. Long story short, they did get a ruling, a favorable ruling from that. It forced Yale to make some changes. But one of the students there, Alexander Brodsky, who had been working with other students, because by then we have social media, right? So all the students are connecting with each other. And this is more your generation than mine. But she connected with a student from Amherst College, my alma mater, named Dana Bolger. And they took everything they had learned in this whole process and they put it online so that students wouldn't have to reinvent the wheel. So they could learn about Title IX. And they called it Know Your Nine. And that was one of the most effective and early advocacy groups around this issue. So I follow Alexander Brodsky through the story. Two women who went to the University of North Carolina, Andrea Pino Silva and Annie Clark, they also were communicating with students elsewhere through social media. They formed an organization called End Rape on Campus. And they actually hopped in their car and they drove around country and used social media to help other students file Title IX complaints. And so you have this whole cascade of complaints coming from all over the country that forced the Office for Civil Rights to react, to clarify the rules and everything. And all of that activism set the stage for the hashtag #MeToo movement, when women online started saying, yeah, I was assaulted, I was harassed, here's what happened to me, right? I mean, Tarana Burke started the #MeToo movement in the 2000s, but the online hashtag #MeToo, the student activists around Title IX set the stage for that to really take off.
I kept thinking when I was reading these, like, you know, like that the mom and then their daughters, and I was like, institutions so rely on like short memories, right? That you're kind of there for 4 years, and like, what a kick in the pants to have a whole movement that's like setting up their kids to go and expect something different.
And that's what these organizations like Know Your Nine and End Rape on Campus are battling, because universities would just wait you out. High schools too. You know, you're going to graduate and move on, whether you're unhappy about athletics or unhappy about sexual harassment, you're going to leave. And if they can wait you out, you're gone. And it worked for a long, long time. But now, and then new students come in and they don't know Title IX, they have to figure it all out again. But now, Know Your Nine and End Rape on Campus are giving them the jump start. So things happen much faster, and they now know which kinds of cases to file so that they don't collapse once they've graduated. It's a whole different ballgame now. I want to give one little shout out to athletics, and then I have a question for you.
Yeah.
But you know, athletics obviously is a big part of the story, because you know, without Title IX, we would not have the amazing women Olympians that we have today. You know, we wouldn't have the WNBA. Who's a WNBA fan?
Women's
Anybody?
soccer.
I know that person back there is. When I went to Amherst College, I was one of the first women to get in 1976. They were just going co-ed. I had never heard of Title IX. I didn't learn about Title IX until the 1980s, long after I graduated. But because of Title IX, they were starting up women's sports. And the coach would roam the halls on campus and grab any woman she could find. Why don't you come try out? Why don't you be on the basketball team? And I thought, sure, why not? So I was on the basketball team because I had shot hoops with my brothers in the driveway, you know. But without Title IX, and even with Title IX, it's still a struggle. Things aren't equal. I, hopefully in an entertaining way in the book, tell you how we, in the 1970s, created the rules that govern all that, which help explain why things still aren't equitable. But we're not, you know, we're not going to talk that much about sports tonight, but I wanted to at least bring that up because it's such an important part of the story. Now,
I thought about two things with the sports. You talk a lot about how, like, so much of it was about not necessarily like supporting men's sports, but preserving football, specifically football, at the expense of both men's and women's other sports. And so I just thought all the time about like what a powerful strategy that is, that divide and conquer, where when you think about who would actually bolster your cause the most, but eschew them to align with this like seemingly more powerful entity. And I also just think about, you know, football, right? Like the NFL has never left the media for being particularly clumsy around gender-based violence issues.
Yeah.
So it's fascinating that that's been a long relationship.
Yeah, you know, that the whole story and how football fits in there is fascinating. Somewhere halfway through working on my book, I decided, well, my next book is going to be called The Final Days of Football.
Oh, I want it.
Because I don't think it's sustainable the way football is today.
Everyone has traumatic brain injuries.
That alone, the TBI alone. But I don't know that I'm going to do another book, and so that has gone to the side. But when Title IX did pass, the first people to freak out were the football coaches and the men's athletic directors. They were like, what? We have to share resources? We have to give some of our money to women's sports? That's insane. One of the coaches testified, Senator, when it comes to college athletics, there's 3 sports. There's men's sports, there's women's sports, and there's football. And they should all be in their own categories and, don't touch football. At the time, Gerald Ford in the White House, he was a former football player. But I have to say, he did the right thing in helping push through the regulations for Title IX. The NCAA, of course, was synonymous with men's sports. First they tried to kill Title IX. Multiple bills in the House and the Senate tried to either derail Title IX, destroy it, or limit it. And several laws were passed over various things in the 1970s to limit it. But then when it became clear they weren't going to kill it, they tried to okay, let's make some rules that will limit the damage. And it was their rules in 1979 that the Office for Civil Rights adopted. After much discussion, and I dwell on this in the book a little bit because all of these debates, they're playing out again today. Mm-hmm. They pop up again and again with different movements and reasons. Today we have the issue of how do we most fairly include transgender athletes in athletics, right? If we as a society believe that athletics is an important part of education, then all students should have access to it. How do we do that the most fairly? And some of the potential solutions were the same things they were debating back then when it comes to women. Should you have just separate men's and women's sports? Should they all be one? Well, at the time, girls had no training in sports. We had not been exposed to it, and men as a whole were bigger and faster. So just having it as one sport meant girls would never get a chance to play, most of them. Okay, well, should we organize it on the basis of height and weight and other factors, kind of like they do in wrestling? Or should we adopt sort of an Olympic model where you have men's and women's teams from each college and they compete against a second college at the same time, and you combine the scores of the men's and women's teams? And then whichever school has the higher composite score is the winner. That would be an incentive to put equal resources into both your men's and women's athletics, right? They could have just split the money down the middle and said, men's and women's athletics are going to get equal amounts of money. That did not go over well. That got pretty quickly derailed, and they have these more complicated formulas for who gets what. But had they done that, we wouldn't have had this whole controversy about the role of football in Title IX. Because if you just said, okay, men's sports, here's your money, do what you want with it.
Yeah. And
if they decided we're going to give it 90% of it to football, and the rest of you who like to play baseball or wrestling or swimming or anything, that's among them. That's their choice. But instead, they blame the women. Mm-hmm. They blame the women for siphoning off the funding because of the more complicated schedule. So it's fascinating.
Do you think if football had just not said anything, nobody would have thought to apply Title IX to athletics? Because you say it was not on their radar.
No.
It would have come eventually.
It would have come eventually. In fact, within 6 weeks of the law passing, Bernice Sandler turned to a young associate who she worked with at the Project on the Status and Education of Women, where she worked at the American Association of Colleges. And she turned to her and said, Margaret, I think athletics is going to be a big deal. Figure it out.
Yeah.
Go figure it out, because I don't know anything about athletics.
Yeah.
And Margaret Dunkel started the first, what they call the laundry list of, okay, what would be fair,
Yeah.
right? It's like, if men get new uniforms, the women should get new uniforms, not the cast-offs from the men. There were women's gymnastic teams reusing the athletic tape that the men had wrapped around their wrists. That's not fair. So,
Or hygienic.
yeah, or hygienic. So it would have come up. It's just, it is so, Title IX is so associated with sports because of the outcry from the men's athletics and because they fought.
Yeah.
There were dozens of bills in Congress. Women's advocates were playing whack-a-mole, trying to knock them all down and preserve Title IX in the 1970s. And then there were lawsuits and blah, blah, blah. It went on and on.
If you've ever seen me walk, I was not an athlete. But one of the things that was striking about your book is like how important athletics has been to anyone being able to access higher education.
Yes.
That like that's a primary avenue for so many people.
Yeah, and earlier I said that Title IX in the beginning was about jobs. It was about jobs and access because it was about getting into the schools that were not letting women in, or limiting them to 40% like Stanford did, or limiting them to 9% as most law schools did. So it was access and jobs, and then once you had the jobs, you know, there were millions of high school and elementary women teachers, but principals? No, those were the men, you know, things like that.
I did a presentation at an elementary school one time, and they were saying if every woman had to, it was when they were doing the National Women's Walkout, where all women were supposed to stop working and see what the world would be like. And the principal was he said it would be me and one of the janitors that would be left at this school.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to ask you, in terms of WISE's work, I know that you look at a broad sector of society. But since my book's about education, talk a little bit about educational systems and educational institutions and what you see there or do there.
I mean, one of the things that I think is most exciting about the work that WISE is doing is prevention programming with little kids. I mean, starting in kindergarten, and we've developed a program across the Upper Valley where we get to see students every single year multiple times from kindergarten through high school to any school that invites us for free. And that has been one of the most powerful things that I've ever had the opportunity to be a part of, because for so many reasons. One of which is that I sort of similarly to Bunny thought like, oh, this will be short. Like, I'll go work for WISE, we'll end violence. That seems like it'll be better, and then we'll move on. But also because working in the schools and working with kids, you realize like that's actually possible. Like little kids get it, and it is not that complicated. And this sense of fairness that I think people in your book were so driven by, like kids also get, that this just isn't fair the way we're doing things right now. So it's amazing. It's an amazing program, and you know, is one of the things that I think is trying to get caught up in some of people trying to keep information away from children. And I think that's why, right? All of these pushes that we see across our country, like currently, that are trying to keep information from young people, because I think young people will realize how unfair it is, the way that we've been set up. So anyways, WISE does that work. If you ever want to hear me talk about WISE's prevention programs, I'll go on for days. And there's lots of information on our website. And the other way that we're engaging with schools is trying to help survivors navigate accessing their education. How can I stay in school and finish my education when horrible things have happened to me there, or people who I see every day have done horrible things to me? And supporting survivors to do that, youth survivors to do that, and also trying to support schools to figure out how do we navigate providing educational opportunities to everyone in a way that actually makes them available to everyone. This idea of like, well, you're free to go to class, but we're not going to change your seating arrangement doesn't actually make it accessible to everyone. And so WISE has youth advocacy. WISE has a campus advocacy coordinator, really trying to develop our skills to support students to access accommodations so that they can pursue their studies and be successful and move on and not be held back because of what peers or adults in the schools or other experiences of violence and trauma have put barriers in place in front of them. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the ways in the last 10 years where I can see progress. Because when I first started looking into Title IX, triggered by those headlines around the activism around sexual assaults on campus, it wasn't necessarily clear to me, and I assume for a lot of people, how Title IX applied to this. Like it's not, when you think of sexual discrimination, at least then we didn't normally think of, rape or, it doesn't deal with jobs or sports or whatever. But all you have to do is think of if you have been assaulted and you're traumatized and you have to live in the same dorm as the person who assaulted you or see them on campus or be in class with them or anything like that. What often happens is that the survivor is stressed and drops out and loses the access to their education. That's the key. Title IX is not about finding guilt or innocence of anyone in any situation. It's about giving every student their right to an education, giving every employee their right to a fair job and a fair assessment of their work. And so if the educational institution does not act on this report that student A harassed or assaulted student B, if they just go, well, that's your problem, it's a personal matter, go deal with it, which is what happened for decades, then you're denying the education to that victim survivor. That's how it's a Title IX issue. And I think people understand that a lot more today than they did 10 years ago. And that's because of the wonderful activism that's been going on, I think.
Yeah, and not to be a downer, but then I think about all of these challenges to Title IX that have really put it in you just said, it's not meant to be a criminal process. It's not meant to determine guilt or innocence.
Right.
And yet so much of the conversation was about due process and what standard of evidence and whether or not there should be live hearings, essentially making it into
a criminal
process, which it is not designed to do, and
has never been friendly to the victim.
Well, and I was just going to say, and that process, those regulations that created that process actually work directly against actually being able to provide people access to their education. Right. Because then they're spending the next year going through a Title IX process as opposed to actually just being able to go to class and do their finals, which is what people want.
Right. When a student has been harassed or assaulted, they have 4 options. They can file a Title IX complaint, they can file a criminal complaint, they can do both, or they can do neither. And any of those options may be the right path for that particular student. It's not either or. Title IX is a civil law. It's not a criminal law. And that's why it uses a different standard evidence, a standard of evidence called the preponderance of evidence. If it's more likely to have happened than not, then you got to deal with it. Whereas criminal, it's beyond a reasonable doubt, because you have to have a higher standard because the potential penalties are much higher. You could lock that person up in a criminal case. That's not going to happen in a civil case. There's lower penalties, and it's all about, in Title IX, preserving the right to education. So I feel like we've gone on for a bit. I want to see if there's any questions. And if not, I could easily talk more. We could sit here and talk all night. But anyone have any questions about Title IX or the book or WISE or anything you want to know from us? That's fine. I'm going to tell you another story then. So another thing that comes up again and again, I interviewed Martin Gary, who was the son of a politician after whom they named gerrymandering. You know that term? But Gerry was the last name, pronounced Gary. He was a Republican, and he was the director of the Office for Civil Rights in the mid-1970s. And he himself was disabled. He uses a wheelchair, and he was a disabled rights activist. And we had a fascinating conversation. But one of the things he pointed out to me, which resonated because it's happening again today in the headlines, he operated under what he called the Latrine theory of civil rights. And what he meant by that was with every civil rights movement, the opponents of civil rights argue on the basis of bathrooms. In the civil rights movement, you mean whites have to share bathrooms with blacks? Oh my God. Then you have the women's movement. They're going to lead us to unisex bathrooms. How horrible would that be? Title IX, they had those same arguments. Under the ADA, the biggest argument was it's too expensive, right, to build an accessible bathroom. And all of those eventually have fallen by the wayside. Well, guess what was the first argument when transgender students said, you know what, I want to be in the bathroom for my gender. They said, no, oh my God, that's horrible. Terrible things could happen. So Bernice Sandler, multiple times when she testified before Congress for Title IX, but also for the Equal Rights Amendment, which was big back then, she pointed out that, you know what, all of those concerns just seem to evaporate when people get on an airplane and everyone has to share the same bathroom, or they live in the same house, you know, and survive to tell about it. So you see these patterns when you look at history, and then you can see the recent political developments more clearly for what they are. They're preying on fear and prejudice. Mm-hmm. I would say, too, that I'm wondering if you, as WISE, have a presence on any of the campuses around here? Like in Dartmouth, do you have services or?
We have an office at Dartmouth, actually. And there are, like, who knew? There are 7 colleges in the Upper Valley. We sort of talk about Dartmouth a lot, but there are 7, including a cartoon school, the School of Hair Design, like all sorts of higher education. And so, yes, WISE has a presence in all of those campuses in different ways, and also just as a general, because we're here for the entire community. But there are different needs for survivors who live on campus, who have to commute to campus. A lot of them are sort of commuter campuses where you live off-site. And all of those present different challenges in terms of if there's only one section of this course, how are you going to be moved into another section of the course, or who will be moved into a different section of this course? If there's only, one traffic light in town, what are the odds that you're going to see this person, and how are we going to navigate around that? If there's only one campus dining room. So we do have a presence in all of those campuses. All of them are a little bit different. And all of them have a different sort of way of understanding and trying to implement the regulations of Title IX. All of them have also different resources in terms of responding to Title IX through the fluctuations from each administration, which you talk about a lot, which is an enormous burden.
Yeah, I mean, although I wrote a history, I'm a journalist and I'm very interested in current events. And what motivated me largely in the book was to learn from history and to see current events more clearly for what they are and have an impact on them. It just comes up in so many different ways. I mean, one of which is this is an election year. Mm-hmm. And it's really clear when you look at the history that the regulations under Title IX, what the rules are, what the guidance is from the Office for Civil Rights, and then whether it's enforced or not, really depends on who's in office. And it really varies by party. And it makes a difference who gets voted into office and deals with enforcing Title IX and appointing who's the director of the Office for Civil Rights.
It was so noticeable reading, like, how much of something's impact is the actual wording of the law and the legislative body, and then there's what are the implementations, how do people experiment with rolling that out, and then what do the courts decide, and then what is the what does OCR decide to do when and if there are complaints. There were like so many different ways that this one tool could play out across the spectrum, like so dependent on any number of factors, but more importantly, people and political parties.
Yeah, and a lot of times we don't see the changes as they're happening. They're more in retrospect. One young woman who I interviewed, who at the time was the director of End Rape on Campus, if you've ever worked for a nonprofit, it's endless work. There's a mountain of things you could do that you wish you had the time and resources to do, and you're never going to get to it all. You do the best you can, and you just keep doing it. And that's how she felt. And sometimes she would just feel a little hopeless. And then she would go do an event, some kind of knowledge fair or a school event, and she'd be at her little literature table. And at one of them, a couple of high school girls came up and they said, "Oh, End Rape on Campus. We have a student chapter of such and such at our school." She didn't, the woman who was the director, she didn't learn about Title IX until well into college. So the idea that these high school girls already were in on this whole subject and knowledgeable about it, she went to another event and two girls from junior high came up and said something similar, and she just thought, oh man, the change is coming. The change is coming. And that what helped keep her going, with the tangible results they could see in individual cases, but from a societal level.
In the podcast that we just did, people's reflections really talk about like when WISE started to do domestic violence, like how scared people were, like what if abusers show up, like how much danger there is, like the doors were locked, it was undisclosed location. And this one woman who worked there for I remember when I started working there, she had worked there as long as I had been alive. And she was just like, and then we decided that this wasn't ours alone, that we had to have the whole community participate in ending violence, that we are not the ones that should be afraid, and that silence is not helping anyone. And she talks about how all of a sudden when we became public and started talking about it and our building was public and people knew where we were, it suddenly got less scary. That having more people felt less scary. And she said in her interview, she said, "This was my life's work, and I don't know what's going to happen next, but I trust that there are people who are doing the work now that will keep figuring it out." And I just think about, the kids we get to work with, the people coming up, we don't have to know what the end is going to be, but we know and can trust that all of us together it's going to come.
The movements keep moving. I think that's a good place to end. I want to thank Kate for joining me tonight in discussion. I want to thank all of you for being here. And let me remind you one more time, I'm going to get a count from Sam at the end of how many books sold tonight, and I will donate 20% of the cover price, which is whatever royalty I would get doubled. So that's a contribution from me. Or if you want to write a check to $100 to Kate right now, I'll give you another book for free. Or if you know anyone who couldn't come tonight, if they buy a book from Norwich Bookstore before the end of the month and send either a screenshot or an email of the receipt to the email address title9book.com, title9book@gmail.com. So it's titleixbook@gmail.com. Send it to me and I'll still make the donation to WISE, because they're worth supporting, don't you think? Okay.
Thank you
for coming.